A dictator is someone with total power over a country. They often take it by force or corruption, then suppress opponents and ignore or change the constitution to stay in power for decades. Many in recent history use this position to enrich themselves by siphoning money from their own country. These leaders are also known as kleptocrats. We're going to examine how they took power, how they gained wealth, how they spent and hid the money, and what ended up happening to it. The sources of this wealth vary between oil, stealing foreign aid, drug production, straight up taking it from the central bank, and even billion-dollar crypto heists. The net worth of each person will increase as we go through this list, from the low billions to the hundreds of billions. These are the richest dictators in modern history. Bashar al Assad and his father Hafez al Assad ruled Syria for 54 years from the 70s until recently, and accumulated billions of dollars in personal fortune taken from the state. Hafez grew up in a small family living a modest rural life before rising through the ranks of the Syrian Air Force and Ba'ath Party. In 1970, he staged a coup within the party, removing rival leaders and taking the presidency. He put loyalists in position of power around him. He used this power to control import licenses, state contracts, ports, and property rents. This is when he started to gain wealth, earning the equivalent of tens of millions of dollars. He shared this wealth with those helping him stay in power, giving his military commanders control of checkpoints, trade routes, and smuggling corridors. With this money, Hafez invested in property and private companies in and outside Syria. This grew his fortune to around $100 million by the late 80s and early 90s. Much of this was kept in offshore trusts, shell companies, and European property purchased by intermediaries and managed by his wife's family, the Makhlouf clan. Hafez died in the year 2000 with a personal net worth estimated at around $1 billion. His son Bashar took over as his successor and inherited this network, which he continued to grow with his mother's side of the family, the Makhloufs, and one cousin in particular, Rami. This side of the family held companies controlling telecoms, banking, retail, construction, oil, and gas, functioning as the commercial arm of the Assad regime. After the Syrian civil war began in 2011, Bashar relied on this wealth to fund his armies and evade sanctions from the international community. His regime was also the largest producer in the world of an amphetamine stimulant type drug called Captagon, which is very popular in the Middle East, and this made an estimated $2.4 billion every year, which mostly went to his inner circle. Property, art, and other assets were traced to France and Switzerland, and he used private planes to move a reported $250 million in cash from the Syrian central bank to Russia in 2018 and 19 as he feared being toppled. The Assads purchased at least 20 luxury apartments in Moscow valued at $40 million. Bashar's wife Asma was known for her shopping sprees, and in 2012 her leaked emails showed her joking about being the real dictator while ordering luxury items during the Syrian civil war. His cousin Rami also dodged sanctions by hiding money in offshore trusts and holding companies in Guernsey. The US State Department estimated Bashar and his wife's personal net worth to be around $2 billion. His whole family's peak net worth was estimated around $5 billion, with some estimates going even higher. His cousin Rami created and owned Syriatel, which was and still is the biggest mobile network in all of Syria. He became one of the wealthiest people in the country, estimated to be worth between 5 and 15 billion, though it's unknown how much of this actually belonged to Assad. In the spring of 2020, he had a public falling out with Assad, where he was placed under house arrest and stripped of his shares in Syriatel, as well as most of his wealth. In late 2024, rebel groups swept the country, forcing the Assads to flee to Russia, ending their 54 years of rule in just 11 days. The Syrian people stormed the abandoned presidential palace, finding fleets of supercars and empty boxes of jewelry and luxury items the family took before escaping to Russia, where the bulk of their fortune was smuggled in the final years of their power. Switzerland froze 112 million euros, France recovered 90 million euros. Due to layers of offshore companies and tax havens in complex legal jurisdictions, it still remains difficult to locate and recover the remaining wealth, which will take decades of legal challenges. The Kim dynasty of North Korea has been in power for over 70 years, and despite most of the country living in poverty under one of the strictest regimes in the world, the Kims have a personal fortune in the billions. Kim Il-sung, the founder of North Korea, grew up in a lower middle-class family. He was prominent in the anti-Japanese guerrilla movement during World War II. He joined Soviet units and was later installed by the Soviet occupation as the leader of the new administration in what was Northern Korea. After a war with the South, he then built the state of North Korea along the borders of the ceasefire line. He didn't have much of a documented personal fortune besides total control over the state and access to whatever he wanted, like the enormous Kumsusan complex as his personal residence. He died in 1994, and things changed after his son Kim Jong Il took power. Outside investigators and high-ranking defectors revealed an entity known as Room 39 or Bureau 39. This is a secret party office that earns foreign currency to maintain a personal fund for the Kim family. It was started in a real office in Pyongyang on the 3rd floor of a building that Kim Jong-il used to work in. The office operates legal businesses like hotels, export firms, and trading companies, but is also involved in counterfeiting the US $100 bill, producing illegal narcotics, arms sales, and insurance fraud, reportedly generating between $500 million to $1 billion every year. This money is also known as a slush fund and is the supreme leader's private stash for whatever they want. Part of it was funneled through North Korea's longtime ambassador to Switzerland into secret accounts in Swiss and Luxembourg banks. This at one point was reported to be worth 3 to 5 billion alone in just 2 countries, but some of this was transferred out in the late 2000s as banking rules were tightened. Further investigations from defectors have revealed purchases of mega yachts, fleets of imported luxury cars, cognac, and food for his inner circle. He also spent it on palaces and villas, extravagant parties, jewelry, armored trains, and $100 million renovations to his father's Kumsusan complex. Estimates from leaked banking tips and intelligence placed his personal fortune at around $5 billion. Room 39 would then transfer to his son and the current supreme leader, Kim Jong Un. A change he made was adding the revenue stream of cryptocurrency fraud through hacking. They pulled off the biggest crypto theft in history with the $1.5 billion heist from Bybit in 2025. The North Korean state has stolen $6 billion worth total in crypto. He's also known to live a life of luxury with armored private trains, supercars, yachts, ski resorts, palaces, watches, and imported luxury goods which are rare in North Korea. It's hard to calculate his exact fortune, but the best estimates quote the equivalent of around $6 billion to him personally, and even more that's untraceable within North Korea itself. War Thunder is the most in-depth vehicle combat game ever made. It's the sponsor of this video and is completely free on PC, consoles, and mobile. It has over 2,500 tanks, planes, helicopters, and ships from 10 nations all throughout history, going from iconic World War II bombers and tanks to modern fighter jets and battleships. It's known for how each vehicle is uniquely modeled, so there's actual strategy to hitting different areas like the fuel tanks or the engines or the crew inside, shown on the X-ray view, which is my favorite feature. Its Daegor engine is optimized to handle the over 95 million players worldwide. It's also now got a mobile version on iOS and Android, so you can play anywhere. Again, War Thunder is completely free, so sign up using my links in the comments or description. New and returning players on PC and console will also get a limited time bonus pack, giving you 100,000 Silver Lions, premium vehicles, 7 days of premium account, the Eagle of Valor decorator, and more. Saddam Hussein grew up in a very poor village in northern Iraq. Initially thinking he would be a school teacher, he joined the Ba'ath Party, which was becoming popular in Syria but was very small in the 50s in Iraq. As the party grew in the mid-60s, so did his position as a revolutionary, taking part in coups and assassinations. In 1968, the Ba'ath Party overthrew the president and he was made vice president, where he was celebrated for nationalizing the main oil company, strengthening the economy, and introducing free healthcare and education. By the 70s, he controlled the Iraqi military and was the de facto ruler over the actual president, who was elderly and in poor health. Saddam eventually forced him to resign in 1979, becoming the actual president. He immediately started to cement his position and infamously purged 68 party members he considered disloyal, executing many of them. His main source of income was from Iraq's oil boom in the 70s. With most of the industry now under state control, he was able to enrich himself. Some oil was sold on a black market, so the revenue was off the books, allowing his regime to take billions without it being detected. It was sold through intermediaries like Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey. Ships would sail under false flags with fake paperwork and transfer the cargo to unmarked ships, hiding where it was coming from and being sold to. The buyers were able to get cheaper oil, and Saddam was able to skim profits while the money was paid through shell companies into his network. After he invaded Kuwait and Iraq was heavily sanctioned, he took billions from the UN's Oil for Food program, where Iraq was allowed to sell oil to use the money only for food, medicine, and humanitarian goods for the struggling population. But Saddam could decide which companies could buy the oil, and he picked ones loyal to him, willing to give him a kickback, and sometimes receiving the full payment without sending any oil, which would then be sold again to someone else. He also bribed UN workers to turn a blind eye. Through these methods, it was estimated that Saddam's personal fortune was around $10.1 billion, taken from the regime's overall revenue of $21 to $30 billion. Forbes ranked him as the 6th richest person on a list of kings, queens, and dictators. He used this money to pay for soldiers, weapons, the chemical weapons used on Iran and the Kurds, and even an attempt at a nuclear weapons program that was ultimately unsuccessful. On one occasion, he withdrew the equivalent of $1 billion from the Central Bank of Iraq. He built at least 48 palaces and complexes around Iraq, some lined with gold, marble, and filled with luxury furniture, worth at least $2 billion combined. His most expensive purchase was the yacht Al Mansur, which was worth around $200 million. His notorious son Uday had a collection of private jets, yachts, armored limos, exotic animals, and hundreds of cars with crates of cash stored around the country. A US-led coalition invaded Iraq in 2003, forcing Saddam into hiding after 24 years in power. Investigators traced his assets to Switzerland, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Panama. $1.3 billion in cash and valuables was recovered early on, and US forces found several boxes of cash around Baghdad containing a total of $950 million. Another $1 billion was frozen in foreign bank accounts and returned, and 8 months after he fled, Saddam was found in a spider hole near a farmhouse with a box of $750,000 in US bills. He was put on trial before an Iraqi tribunal and executed for his crimes against humanity. Ferdinand Marcos grew up in a middle-class family. At 18, he was convicted of murdering his father's rival, and in prison studied law, where he argued his own case and was acquitted due to a lack of evidence. He became a lawyer and served in World War II in the Philippine Army with the US against Japan. As a celebrated war hero, he became an assistant to the first president of the independent Philippines, and then became a prominent politician before being elected president in 1965. Facing civil unrest, he fraudulently declared martial law in 1972, censoring the media, changing the constitution, and violently suppressing opposition, becoming a dictator with absolute power. He appointed allies to run state monopolies of sugar, tobacco, media, shipping, and import-export industries. He then took massive commissions from state projects like roads, dams, and public buildings, and a court found that a $50 million kickback was taken by him from an energy plant contract. He also took a portion from $550 million of Japanese World War II reparations by appointing his golfing friend as the ambassador to Japan to oversee this. The US provided $80 million of military aid in exchange for him sending Filipino troops to fight in Vietnam, which Marcos also skimmed an unknown amount from. He created shell companies to hold property abroad, as well as in Swiss bank accounts under the well-documented fake names of William Saunders and Jane Ryans for him and his wife. His worldwide assets are also very well documented. In the Philippines, he owned around 50 properties known as the Marcos Mansions, worth today's equivalent of around $700 million. In the 80s, he bought the Crown Building in Manhattan, New York, for today's equivalent of around $180 million. As well as 40 Wall Street for today's equivalent of $200 million, which was later purchased by Donald Trump and is now called the Trump Building. Also in New York, he bought the 200 Madison Building for $150 million, He owned land in Texas worth $150 million, and Long Island property worth $63 million, Seattle worth $32 million, London worth $60 million, and Rome worth $65 million. On top of this, he had properties in New Jersey, Hawaii, a California bank, gold and diamond companies in South Africa, banks and hotels in Israel, and land in Austria. Officially, his salary as president was around $13,500 a year. His wife's wardrobe made headlines containing gowns, handbags, and thousands of pairs of shoes worth millions, which are now displayed in museums. She owned a rare collection of jewelry known as the Marcos jewels, valued today at around $28 million. The most conservative analysts estimate his personal fortune to be a minimum of $13 billion, but updated, more accurate figures now suggest it was most likely closer to $30 billion, including his family and allies over his 20-year rule, with about $10 billion taken in only the final few years of his regime. He became increasingly unpopular as the Filipino economy collapsed. Documents also exposed his finances and election fraud and human rights abuses. It was also found he falsified and massively exaggerated his narrative as a decorated World War II hero, and after the assassination of his main political rival, he faced mass protests, defections, and eventually the loss of support from the military. This forced Marcos to flee with his family to Hawaii in 1986. He was given safe passage by the US, who initially supported him because of the Philippines' proximity to Vietnam and their shared opposition to communism in Asia. This is why he owned so much property in the US as an escape plan, but the US support faded by the 80s as he became a liability. He was flown out on US military planes, and he reported taking with him 22 crates of cash containing $717 million, 300 crates of jewelry, a rare gold Buddha statue filled with diamonds, and bank deposit slips worth $124 million, but much of this was seized by the US upon arrival. He continued to live a lavish life on his Hawaii property, where he tried to even raise an army to invade and overthrow the new Philippine government, and US President Reagan placed him under island arrest when he learned about this. In the final days, he offered to return 90% of his wealth to the Philippines if he could be buried there, which was denied by the government, and he died shortly after in 1989 at age 72. After a long legal battle, Swiss authorities returned $683 million to the Philippines. Operation Big Bird claimed a total of $7.5 billion was held in just Swiss accounts alone, but only $700 million of it was recovered. The billions of US property was already sold off in the 80s as it was foreclosed and taken by the banks, and portions were returned to the Philippines, and in total around $5 billion has been recovered from all the international sources, but it's estimated the majority still remains out there and the work to return it continues. Despite Ferdinand's reputation, the Marcos family remained in politics, and his son, Ferdinand Jr., is the current president of the Philippines. Suharto was born into a peasant farming family when Indonesia was still a Dutch colony. He served in the Indonesian security forces under the Japanese occupation during World War II, and after joined the newly formed Indonesian army during the struggle for independence from the Dutch. He rose to the rank of Major General soon after Indonesia gained independence in 1949. Suharto led forces that stopped a different group from overthrowing the president, and then took power himself, becoming the acting president in 1967, creating a new regime that would last 30 years. With this power, he and his inner circle gave licenses and contracts for timber, mining, plantations, and imports to companies of their choice, which then gave huge profits to his regime. He also controlled banks and trading agencies to direct money where he was able to skim from the top, including a 70% share of the largest private bank called Juta. In the 70s, Indonesia also experienced an oil boom, which helped the country prosper while further enriching himself as he ran the trading companies. His family bought 3.6 million hectares of land, which is larger than Belgium, buying plots at 6% of the market value, often using soldiers to threaten poor farmers to sell. He also bought high-value property, luxury cars, fleets of planes, and he expanded the family business into media and construction, which they would then also take profits from. His son Tommy even owned a majority stake in the car company Lamborghini, as well as hotel chains, golf courses, and a whole airline company. The family money was diverted to Switzerland, Austria, Singapore, Hong Kong, and the Caribbean through front companies and more famously a charity network containing one called the Suharto Foundation. Transparency International counted his net worth was the equivalent of around $35 billion, and others went as high as $45 billion stolen by his entire network. An extensive investigation claimed that at least $73 billion went through his family over 35 years, though his official salary as president was around $1,700 a month. After the Asian financial crisis, the economic bubble burst and he became increasingly unpopular. The US also supported his regime for his firm stance against communism in Asia and provided $100 million a year, but with the collapse of the Soviet Union, this support ended. As Indonesia's economy faced total collapse, mass protests against his regime forced him to resign in 1998. The authorities then investigated and started to recover assets. The courts ordered $325 million to be returned from the Suharto Foundation charity, and $135 million was seized from a different firm. It's estimated the family skipped tax payments of around $10 billion in total and owed banks $800 million from loans that were never repaid. An investigation by Time claims that $9 billion still remains in one Austrian bank. After stepping down and handing power to his vice president, he retired to private life in Jakarta, enjoying his wealth. He faced massive corruption charges, but due to his poor health was declared unfit for trial until he died in 2008, aged 86, being honored with a state military funeral and a week of mourning. His billionaire son Tommy was convicted of assassinating a Supreme Court judge that previously convicted him of corruption and refused a bribe. He was sentenced to 15 years in a luxury jail cell, being allowed to leave and play golf whenever he wanted. He was then released after only 4 years. Most of the Suharto circle never faced justice, as the government feared the immensely wealthy and still powerful Suharto family, who is currently members in government, including Suharto's son-in-law, who is the current president since 2024. 6 members of the family own majority shares in 560 companies today. Out of the tens of billions he stole, very little was recovered, and the family is currently estimated to be worth around $15 billion. Ali Abdullah Saleh was born into a poor family in Yemen. He joined the army as a teenager, going from infantry to the tank division and rising through the military. He took part in a coup that removed the king, becoming colonel in 1976. He then became a military governor and was elected by parliament to be president after the last one was assassinated. He consolidated power by putting family and loyalists in positions around him. He started to gain wealth by taking kickbacks from mainly oil and gas contracts. Companies would have to pay him to search for oil, and he got a piece of every deal that was made and the production. He manipulated license auctions so that companies overpaid, and over decades he could skim billions in profits along with his allies who ran the monopolies in these industries. His regime was earning $2 billion a year for decades, according to a UN panel. He didn't live a visible, lavish lifestyle and wasn't seen in mansions or yachts, but privately was buying land, property, stakes in companies, as well as huge gold reserves. UN investigators in 2015 and 16 reported that Saleh was alleged to have amassed assets between $32 and $60 billion. This was mostly transferred abroad under false names and shell companies held in around 23 different countries. Examples of these movements show a $33 million transfer from a Swiss account and an $84 million one from Singapore to the UAE. 2 of his sons were found to be acting as financiers, managing the network, and one was the ambassador to the UAE, where the money was being moved through. The UN's official figure of 32 to 60 billion is staggering compared to the economy of Yemen, which was consistently ranked as one of the poorest countries in the world. His siphoning of wealth added to the widespread poverty and humanitarian crisis Yemen still faces today. He was removed from power after the Arab Spring protests hit Yemen, handing over to his vice president. He still remained politically active and allied with the Houthi movement against that new president. In 2017, he split with the Houthis and tried to side with their enemies Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and was then killed by the Houthis later that year. The UN Security Council attempted asset freezes and sanctions to recover some of the international money, but this proved mostly unsuccessful. Some funds were returned from Turkey and identified in Switzerland, but this remains difficult because of the hidden ownership of accounts, secrecy laws, and the collapse of Yemen's state institutions, so only a tiny amount has actually been found. Muammar Gaddafi ruled Libya for over 40 years, and the scale of his wealth has often made headlines. He was born into a poor, nomadic Bedouin family in the desert, being goat and camel herders. He joined the Royal Military Academy in Benghazi, creating his own revolutionary group which after much planning would occupy airports, police depots, radio stations, and government offices, eventually deposing the unpopular and Western-backed King Idris in a bloodless coup. As chairman of his revolutionary group, he made himself colonel and became the de facto leader of the new Libyan Arab Republic. Libya generated massive revenue from oil, which would become the main source of his wealth as this was nationalized, so he controlled who got contracts, licenses, and rents. Other sources were from construction, import-export companies, agriculture, and security contracting. These were given to his family, who then redirected payments and shares to Gaddafi's circle. He created the Libyan Investment Authority to manage the pool of billions in assets and foreign investments, and while this was officially a state fund, Gaddafi and his family controlled how it was used and would take whatever they wanted for themselves. His regime stored money all over the world, but was mainly in Europe and the Americas, as well as some in the Middle East and Africa. He built one compound in Tripoli, which was a massive, heavily fortified structure to be his central palace. In 2003, he paid $120 million for an Airbus A340 and also owned other planes and yachts. His children also enjoyed this wealth, with one son famously paying Beyoncé $2 million to perform at a New Year's Eve party at St. Bart's in 2009. When the Arab Spring reached Libya, it turned from wide-scale protests to riots into a civil war. Eventually, rebels helped by NATO forces toppled Gaddafi, and he was brutally killed by a Libyan mob on camera. The Libyan Investment Fund alone was valued at $60 to $70 billion. In total, the UN declared in 2011 that worldwide efforts had frozen $150 billion from Gaddafi's regime, which today would be worth around $200 billion. This unimaginable number was only the amount found internationally, meaning there was even more that wasn't found in and outside of Libya. It's impossible to know how much of this belonged to Gaddafi personally. It is normal for a country to invest its money internationally, but what was unusual was the use of shell companies and offshore tax havens under false names controlled by his family to deliberately hide what was personal or state assets. So because Gaddafi controlled the money in this unique way is why it's often described as his fortune. In the final months of his regime, he sold 20% of the country's gold reserves worth over $1 billion. The US Treasury reported freezing over $34 billion in assets, including stakes in General Electric, Halliburton and ExxonMobil Oil, and the Citigroup Bank. Italy seized $1 billion in family assets made up of shares in Italy's biggest bank worth $600 million, an oil and gas company, the Fiat Motor Group, an Italian defense company, the Juventus Football Club, as well as 150 hectares of land on an island off the coast of Sicily. The Netherlands froze around $4 billion. Germany reported a $530 million stake in the Siemens technology company. Switzerland froze $416 million in assets. Finland reported the regime had significant shares in its Nokia mobile company. The UK froze around $20 billion total in assets, including $900 million worth of cash stored in the northeast of England. Out of the $150+ billion that was frozen by all these countries, only a few billion has been returned to Libya as it entered into a second civil war, with many rival factions claiming to be the legitimate government. The money and its interests still legally belong to Libya and can't be touched by anyone else, but it still remains in limbo while Libya is in one of the most unstable periods in its history since the fall of Gaddafi. Vladimir Putin is often said to be one of the richest people in the world. Having led Russia for nearly 26 years, if he completes his current term until 2030, he would surpass Joseph Stalin as the longest-serving politician in Russian history. He was born into a working-class family in what's now St. Petersburg. He worked at the KGB intelligence agency in the Soviet era and eventually its successor, the FSB, after the fall of the Soviet Union. He was appointed Prime Minister in 1999 by the President Boris Yeltsin, and months later became president himself after Yeltsin resigned. He's ruled the country since then. Even when he briefly stepped down to be Prime Minister, he still had all the power. And after returning as president again, he later changed the constitution so his previous terms didn't count, and only he can have a 5th and 6th term until 2036, unless he changes it again to go longer, which is possible. The elections are considered fraudulent and not competitive, and he suppressed opposition, so this is why many claim he meets the criteria of a dictator. The majority of his wealth comes from his system of oligarchs. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the major industries that were owned by the communist government ended up with a small circle of businessmen called oligarchs, who went from multi-millionaires to multi-billionaires. These industries were mainly oil and gas, but also mining, banking, telecoms, media, and export trading. It was one of the biggest asset transfers in history. Before becoming president, Putin was involved in redistributing some of these assets to the oligarchs, and now as president has full knowledge and control over them, with some being his longtime close friends. The system is nicknamed Kremlin Inc. The oligarchs are given state contracts and favors. In return, they hold assets controlled by Putin and Russia but in their own names. The central financial hub is called Bank Russia, which is described as the personal bank for his inner circle and elites, whose chairman since 2004 is Putin's longtime close friend. One of the most famous oligarchs who crossed Putin and was imprisoned is Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who was at one point the richest man in Russia, worth 15 billion. He claimed that the oligarchs are all subordinates of Putin, who has total control over them. Putin has a declared salary of around $140,000 a year and officially owns one small apartment, 2 vintage cars, and a small account of bank savings. However, investigations and leaks from defectors tell a different story. His most famous purchase is the enormous complex on the Black Sea, nicknamed Putin's Palace, which cost $1.4 billion to build. It's the largest private residence in Russia. It sits on 7,800 hectares of land with the same no-fly zone designation as nuclear and military facilities. It's guarded by the FSB and has its own border checkpoint and is technically considered a separate state within Russia. It features massive underground structures and reinforced tunnels, missile air defense systems, a church, indoor pools, a casino, cinemas, a vineyard, ice hockey rink, helipads, and a greenhouse. This was exposed by drone footage by Putin's biggest opponent, Alexei Navalny, who died in Russian prison, and Putin denied owning the property as it's technically under the name of one of his oligarch close friends. Several contractors leaked hidden camera photos, videos, and its floor plans, which is where all of this comes from, revealing the property has serious mold problems due to humidity and poor construction, leading to sections collapsing and others needed to be gutted and started again, which is why it's cost over $1 billion to construct so far, and the whole project has apparently been a disaster, so he doesn't live there yet. Putin is reported to have at least 20 residences, with some of them having nearly identical replica offices to conceal his actual location. Investigations from Sistema analyzed 700 videos and found differences in door handles and wall panels between 3 of his main residences. But the one he spends the most time in is a complex on Lake Valdai, sitting on around 80 acres of land, only accessible by one road with a large perimeter wall that goes over part of the lake. It also has a no-fly zone designation, and recently installed Panzer S-1 air defense systems on this structure, positioned to shoot down Ukrainian drones coming from the south, which have been fired recently at his residences. The complex has a marina with yachts, helipads, lake houses, and villas dotted all around the coast for friends and family, and even a Chinese-inspired property. Investigators from Proect leaked photos from inside Putin's main residence showing rooms filled with gold, casinos, spas, and luxury furniture. He's believed to be the mysterious owner of one of the largest super yachts in the world, worth $700 million, which was recently seized by Italy for being suspected of being owned by Putin. It's also claimed he owns another yacht worth $100 million. Bill Browder is a financier and was the largest foreign investor in Russia. After his lawyer was killed in Russian prison for exposing corruption, Browder began to speak out against Putin and in 2017 testified to the US Senate intricate details of Putin's network. He claimed that Putin was the richest man in the world with a net worth of $200 billion, and that the oligarchs have to give Putin 50% in order to remain out of jail. The US congressional staff also estimated his net worth to be in the range of 40 to 200 billion. He hasn't given any indication of wanting to retire and enjoy his wealth, but in the meantime, Putin continues to wield massive power and grow immensely wealthy. Thanks again to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. You can play it completely free now on PC, PlayStation, Xbox or mobile using my links in the pinned comments or description, which will get you that limited time bonus pack on PC and console if you're new or haven't played in 6 months.